All right. All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm excited for this week's Village Torah. This week's Torah portion is Vayehi. It is the final Torah portion in the book of Genesis. So that is what we are talking about today, and it's the final chapters. And
Cool.
yeah, it is cool, and it actually starts off. It's really the end of Jacob's life. Jacob, who is also known as Israel, and it's sort of the book of Genesis really starts off with, it goes basically sort of the high points are from Adam to Noah, ultimately to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And really, once we close off with Jacob's life, so too do we close off with the book of Genesis. Because then next week, we're going to move on to the very beginning of the book of Exodus, which really starts with the challenges of the children of Israel and the descendants of Israel in Egypt. And then ultimately, spoiler alert, ultimately then escaping from Egypt. So, but we don't see those challenges. We don't see those problems in the book of, at least now, we don't see them in the book of Genesis, because Egypt is actually a good place. It's a place of opportunity, because that is where Joseph is, basically, who's one of the children of Jacob. He is I want to call him like a vizier or viceroy or something, but he has a significant role in the Egyptian government. It's significant. He is a person of significance in Pharaoh's, ruling retinue, his court, as it were. So this starts off with really Jacob is dying. And actually that's why it's called Vayehi. So Vayehi is literally the first word of this week's Torah portion, and it literally means, and he lived. And he lived. And so it talks about how Jacob lived in Egypt for the final 17 years of his life. And basically that's how it starts off. He's dying. And so we then get to an entire chapter after that, which is Joseph then brings forth his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, for really Jacob to bless them, which is, we don't have a lot of deathbed scenes in the Torah, which makes this one particularly stand out. In addition to that, despite people living very long lives in the Torah, and certainly in the book of Genesis, we shockingly do not have, off the top of my head, I don't know many instances in which we see direct interaction between grandparents and grandchildren. And so that's what stands out here. We all know that people are having children and their children having other children, and one can line up the timelines and easily do the math and find that they definitely live at the time of their grandchildren, and who knows, maybe they're also living to see their great-grandchildren. What we see in chapter 48 in this week's Torah portion, I think that's what stands out, is this interaction here.
Unknown caller.
Between Jacob and Manasseh and Ephraim, his grandsons. What stands out, I think, also between Manasseh and Ephraim is that they are born in the land of Egypt. Jacob, he's lived in Canaan, and now he's moved over to Egypt, really for material economic gain. I mean, just opportunity. Now, Jacob is definitely on the older side, so he probably just lived with his sons. But there was a famine in the land, which drove them down to Egypt, but there was great opportunity. And so that's what the Jews are doing there, the children of Israel, the Bnei Yisrael, the Israelites, that's what's brought them down. And then after that, chapter 48, we see Jacob basically blessing all of his sons and describing each one of them, and they're all very different as to what they each bring to the table. Which says something interesting, I think, about how well parents know their own children and know how different they can be one from the next, and what different whether it's talents, but also challenges to the table, and sort of what that says even about the future, including their own offspring. And ultimately, at the very end of the Torah portion, we see Jacob being buried, but what's really striking is that he's embalmed in the Egyptian way, because he's living in Egypt and his son Joseph has attained a certain rank of importance within the Egyptian government, and so he's embalmed, which is a really strange.
We don't embalm.
What?
Do we?
What?
We don't embalm.
We don't nowadays. No, that was something that they did in Egypt, and I don't know. Maybe because of the air, something to do with that. I think it was just Egyptian burial practice, and what stands out about that is how much of a distinctly Egyptian practice that was, an Egyptian death or burial practice, and yet the Torah goes out of its way to mark that this is happening, because that's not atypical. It almost sounds as if this has never happened in the Torah, certainly not for any of the I want to say the Jewish, but any of the Abraham, Isaac, any of them, it's never happened before. Now that they have left Canaan, now that they're in the land of Egypt, now they're taking on the burial practices of the Egyptians, which includes this embalming. Which, yeah, it's funny to think about that, because ultimately Joseph himself, his bones are then taken much later on in the book of Genesis, as by Moses, that when they leave Egypt, they take Joseph's bones. So I suspect he was, very unsurprisingly, because of his role in the Egyptian government, he was taken probably to be embalmed, and then his bones were then salvaged, rescued, whatever it was, and then taken.
Now, tell me, you said that his bones, Jacob's bones, were carried out of Egypt. Is that right?
Joseph's bones.
Is that what you said?
I said ultimately,
Joseph's bones.
yeah, later on in the rest of the Torah, we ultimately see Joseph's bones being carried out by Moses when they depart from Egypt, which is another connection to what we see here about the death and burial practices of
Egypt.
Yeah, of Egypt, although it's specifically of Bnei Israel, the Israelites following in the burial and death practices of the Egyptians, which is it's an interesting move. I think that for me, this Torah portion also brings to the fore, especially in chapter 48, when we have this interaction between Jacob and his grandsons Manasseh and Ephraim, that these are grandsons of his who were born and are being brought up in Egypt, which is a foreign land. They are not, because really Israel and the children of Israel have really been living in the land of Canaan. That's what they've experienced, and now they're in a land not their own. And it really is a fascinating model for really millennia to come, as yes, there have been many centuries in which the Jewish people have lived on their own land, in the land of Israel. That's true. That happens. But there also have been many centuries in which Jews have lived in exile, that Jews have lived in the diaspora, such as us. We do not currently reside in the land of Israel. We are living in the Jewish diaspora. We are living in exile. And so how much we want to perceive this as, especially as Jacob is a grandfather. He's lived most of his life in the land of Canaan, and now he's spent the last 17 years of his life where his son is now living, which is in a different land, and presumably Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, so Jacob's grandsons, are being brought up in a tremendously different culture than the one in which Jacob has lived and raised his children, which I suspect is not an unfamiliar trope, or it's not an unfamiliar thing that occurs, where grandparents are seeing their children being raised in a very different way, or coming up with a very different lifestyle and culture than the ones that they necessarily have, or I don't know, or used to.
Okay.
And so that's really, I think, what's going on here, which is just so fascinating to me. It's not just the deathbed piece, but it's also, how do you transmit the values to your grandchildren?
Right.
Especially when they're
Right.
coming up with values that are much different and are in such a different cultural context than the one in which the grandparent is used to.
Right.
And so, and whether it's instilling Jewish values, living in the diaspora much as we are, which is certainly its own challenge, but even taking away the particularly Jewish aspect of it, I think that's a universal. I think that's a more universal thing of grandparents seeing their grandchildren coming up in a different world than their own.
What do you mean by diaspora?
Diaspora is basically, there's Jews live in two parts of the world. They either live in the land of Israel or outside of the land of Israel. And so
Right.
Jews living outside of the land of Israel are living in the diaspora.
Okay. All right. Now,
Uh,
okay, I understand.
yeah, I think it comes from the Greek,
Probably.
but it's really just a dispersion of people.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood what you meant.
Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. So yeah, comes from Greek, diaspora, meaning to scatter, to spread about. So I think this word diaspora really was used primarily to describe Jews living outside of the land of Israel, living in the diaspora, although recently it's been taken on for other peoples. So
Yes. Yes.
you're right. But it really originated with the Jews, because the Jews were this sort of ever diasporic people, that we lived so much of our existence not in our own land,
Right.
which is a strange concept for most peoples, because they typically live in their own land,
That's right.
right? And so the Jews are this weird anomaly.
Since when have we been normal?
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Uh,
So yeah, so I think that's a really, for me, that's a really interesting model to see, especially
mhm,
knowing where we are here, that we have a lot of grandparents, we have a lot of great grandparents even, and
mhm.
I imagine there's some interesting interactions that take place between them and their grandchildren, and even deathbed. I see, unfortunately, I mean, just owing to the nature of where we are and who lives here, we also see deathbed scenes, which is both a, it's obviously it's an unfortunate thing to see people go, but it's also a nice blessing. Sometimes, we read about terrible car accidents, and we read about other terrible tragedies, but even to have the blessing to be able to spend time with someone before they pass, and they know that they're going, is not a luxury that everybody has. I mean, obviously now it's
No.
especially now where people are, especially if they're dying of coronavirus, right? There's been over 300,000 Americans who've died of it. Usually their families can't see them in their final days.
Mhm.
And so even this is a blessing. If someone, it's a mixed blessing, obviously. No one wants to see the passing of a loved one, let alone a parent or grandparent. And yet it is actually not to be taken for granted, and to have this final connection between between children and grandchildren.
Correct.
So yeah, I actually never, before coming here, but also before the pandemic, I don't know how much we would have necessarily seen deathbed interactions between children and grandchildren as necessarily blessings, but I think they're
Mhm.
valuable to, it's the silver lining.
Yes, it is.
To be able
Very
to have
much.
that, to be able not only to have that interaction, but even some potential closure,
Hmm.
which is, again, not a luxury that everybody has.
Hmm. No, they don't.
right. And
And
especially,
and by not having that natural closure, they don't, there's a depth of understanding of death and of the individual and their life that
hmm,
they totally miss out on.
yeah, 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 yeah. So I think before this week and before really before this year, I never perceived this particular Torah portion as
Mm-hmm.
as its own blessing of being able to have this interaction of being able to even have a sense of closure, uh, which I think is really one of the strange wonders of going through the Torah portion every year and have
Mm-hmm.
into what's going on. And certainly here, this is not even a particularistic Jewish insight, it's a universal insight of really being able to understand the blessing of a final, really a deathbed scene between children and grandchildren.
Yes. Now I was able to see that with Michael, my son-in-law,
Yeah.
and his grandfather.
Mhm.
It was a beautiful thing.
Mm.
They all had time to do that.
Oh, wow.
And that was grandson and father, and then wife,
Mm.
and then Harvey. It was really very important.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Great. So it's my piece.
That's your piece. Is that our reading tonight today?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to focus on. And like I mentioned, I think some of these things I've really become sensitized to in my 7 months here at Cedar Village that I
Uh-huh.
really hadn't considered before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's a new insight. I mean, I'll throw in one other thing, which is just even thinking. I'll close off with this. Even in thinking about the very first word, and this is the same word that is what we call the Torah portion by Vayehi, and Vayehi,
Mm-hmm.
and he lived. And I don't think that's to be taken for granted, which is
No,
it's not really focusing on his death. It's really focusing on how he had lived
his life.
his life.
That's what's
And
so beautiful about it,
yeah,
is
yeah,
his life.
yeah.
And everyone has a life,
Mm-hmm,
a legacy.
mm-hmm,
And we had to write a couple of years ago. We wrote a legacy, what we wanted to impart and leave to our children and our grandchildren.
mm-hmm,
And it really was fun, but it was also a very important document of thought to give to our grandchildren and our children.
mm-hmm,
And I don't think many people ever do that.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I was about to say I think it's more of a recent phenomenon, and that may be
Hmm.
true, but at the same time, we do to some extent see echoes of that even in this week's Torah portion of a bit of an ethical will that Jacob is imparting to his not only children but grandchildren, as we see.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm glad that came out of here. That's really important. I
Mhm.
didn't realize where it came from. And I'm real glad that you discussed that today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You
I
take
appreciate it.
care.
All right. Take care,
Bye
Deb.
bye.
All right, bye.